Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and this week we will be discussing another poem, specifically Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats from 1819. But before we get into Ode to a Nightingale, I want to quickly remind everyone that my second novel, Grand Tour, is coming out in September, on September 29th. You can pre-order it now on Amazon or Bookshop or whatever website you prefer. It'll be released as an audiobook as well, so be on the lookout for that. It's a novel about a young man who travels across Europe in the summer of 2012 at the age of 23. He's a graduate student in art history, and he's struggling to find a sense of meaning in the modern world and finds himself drawn more to old paintings, old texts, to the past, to history, and wants to escape there. In many ways, I think what John Keats writes about in Ode to a Nightingale, this desire to escape the real world into the dreamlike fairy world of fantasy and poetry, it's not so different than what my character in some ways desires. I mean, clearly this is a universal longing that so many of us, especially those of us who are more artistically inclined, feel. So with that, let's get into Ode to a Nightingale. You know, Ode on a Grecian Urn, the previous ode of his that we looked at, that, as I said, was a poem about history, about time. It celebrated the images on the urn, but it also suggested that there is some transcendent meaning beyond the physical world, beyond our world. I emphasized in our analysis of that poem how that was a very different argument, so to speak. That was a very different philosophical idea about sensory pleasure as compared to the first poem of John Keats that we looked at, The Eve of St. Agnes. In The Eve of St. Agnes, Keats really celebrated and delighted in sensory pleasure. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he started to question the sensory world and suggest that there was something beyond it, a spiritual and transcendent world. In Ode to a Nightingale, I believe he does something similar. You know, this is a poem in which the nightingale comes to symbolize a transcendent spiritual dimension that Keats's speaker accesses through his dreams or through a dreamlike state. And I think the big idea of this poem and the reason it's so haunting and so beautiful is Keats is really exploring this question of art and poetry. How do we make art? How do we write poetry? And do we have to have access to something beyond our world? Do we need to enter a dreamlike state, the dreamlike state that the nightingale suggests? A lot of the analysis of this poem focuses on a concept that Keats describes called negative capability, which has to do with how do artists approach these ideals. Now, I'm not going to talk about this phrase, negative capability. A lot of scholars have done great work on connecting and kind of drawing out this idea and applying it to his poetry. I think it's perfectly valid and perfectly interesting. But as I've said before, you know, with these podcasts, and especially with my analysis of poems, I don't want to start bringing in too many outside ideas. You know, personally, I don't like necessarily the idea that in order to understand or be moved by a poem like Ode to a Nightingale, you have to have this theoretical knowledge of a concept like negative capability. I don't believe that's how poetry should be read. I don't believe you have to have an academic's knowledge of all of John Keats's letters in order to be moved by this poem. And so because of that, I am going to try as hard as possible to avoid making references to things beyond the text. Because I believe the text itself is enough. I believe the text is really all you need to have an emotional experience with this poem. Now, that does not take away from the work of academics who have worked to connect the poem to ideas like negative capability. I find it very fascinating, and if you're interested, there's lots to read about on the internet. But, like I said, in this podcast, I want to keep the focus on the text itself. So Ode to a Nightingale, much like Ode on a Grecian Urn, has 10-line stanzas. Ode on a Nightingale is a little longer. This poem has 8 10-line stanzas rather than simply 5. The rhyme scheme is pretty similar to Ode on a Grecian Urn. A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E. So there is this distinction, there is a separation in each of Keats's stanzas between the first 4 lines and the last 6 lines. There's a movement in each of the stanzas. What's interesting with this poem, though, and what makes it distinct is it is primarily iambic pentameter, except for the 8th line of every stanza. The 8th line of every stanza is a line of trimeter. The 8th line of every stanza only has 3 beats rather than 5 beats. This is intentional, and we're going to talk about why he does this, but the general effect is it creates this moment of tension in the 8th line of the poem that then releases in the 9th and 10th lines, in the final 2 lines. So it's almost like a breath. It's like you take in a breath and then you release. I think it creates a very specific ebb and flow rhythm to the poem. And in general, we're going to discuss this as we look at the stanzas, the ebb and flow rhythm that reflects, I believe, this dreamlike state that Keats wants to create for us. I think in the rhythms of the poem, and especially in that 8th shorter line, he allows us to feel this dynamic and dreamlike flow. And we're going to note the way the flow is also present in the way one stanza moves into the next. It's very artfully done. Let's just look at the first stanza and let's read it out loud. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and leathwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. So let's take a look at this stanza. So the first thing hopefully you notice with this first set of 10 lines is what I talked about earlier, the division of the poem into 2 clear parts based on the rhyme scheme. So the first 4 lines, A, B, A, B, pains, drunk, drains, sunk, right? Those are the last 4. So there's a clear connection between those first 4 lines. So the first 4 lines kind of seem to establish him entering almost this dream state. His heart aches, he feels drowsy and numb, he feels as though he's taken hemlock, right? Hemlock was an herb that was associated both with, putting someone to sleep, but also with death. So there is this tension in this poem between the sleep state and death. Keats is going to think and reflect a lot in this poem on what it might mean to die. He almost seems to be suggesting that there is some connection between the state we enter when we sleep and dream and death. And then, of course, he refers to an opiate, which has a similar function, and then leathwards had sunk. So the river Lethe. In Greek mythology, right, the idea of the river Lethe was that after you die, it was one of the rivers in the underworld. After you die, you are meant to drink from this river, and that erased the memories of your mortal lives. So Keats is bringing up all these associations, hemlock, opiates, and Lethe, in order to emphasize he's going to sleep, right? And this sleep is going to prepare him for this experience with the nightingale. But also, he wants us to connect the idea of sleep and death, right? There is this uneasy line between sleep and death, this blurred line, and he wants to emphasize that blurred line. So those are the first 4 lines that kind of set up this sleep-death state. Then the next 6 lines, he introduces us to the nightingale and to what is he feeling. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness. So what does he say? He's not actually sad or melancholy, even though this poem began with this declaration, my heart aches. Right, that declaration, by the way, my heart aches, I like that because, this poem is traditionally iambic pentameter, mean, this is something we see all the time with poets. Sometimes they will break the iambic part. They might still have 5 beats, but they will break the order of stressed and unstressed. They vary them for dramatic effect. My Heart Aches is not iambic. And as a result, right, it's almost like all 3 of those beats are stressed. My heart aches, or you could say heart and aches are both stressed. But the point is, it's not an iamb, right? It's not an iambic structure. And what that does, by breaking the iambic pentameter in the very first line, he wants to emphasize the kind of dissonance of that feeling, the fact that Keats's heart aches. So, he begins the poem with this negative feeling, this idea of heartache, for whatever reason. Is it related to love? Perhaps. Perhaps it's a broader heartache. As we're going to see in this poem, the speaker, right, Keats's poet, Keats's speaker, really has this disaffection, dissatisfaction with the world, with the mortal world. And perhaps that's what's causing his heartache at the beginning. And he says here, he's not envious of the nightingale, but he's too happy in its own happiness. It's almost like when he sees the nightingale, he feels too happy. This is important because this poem, it's not really going to be a total celebration of what the nightingale allows Keats to experience. Because for Keats, the experience that the nightingale awakens him to, I use the word awakens there purposefully because Keats does have this question at the end about what was the dream and what was the waking state. This experience that the nightingale awakens him to, it's not totally a positive experience because for Keats, the fact that he is still mortal and he has been given access briefly to this immortal world actually pains him even more. It's the pain of someone who knows they cannot have this thing forever. It's the pain of someone sad who sees something happy and cannot take pleasure in the happiness. That's what Keats is describing here. He is too happy in the happiness of the nightingale, and this makes him sad. This makes him upset implicitly. So the rest of the stanza just sort of introduces the nightingale, and again introduces some of the forest imagery that we're going to see a lot of, the natural imagery that we're going to see a lot of in this poem, right? The dryad of the trees. Dryads, of course, were figures in Greek mythology, kind of nymphs of the woods. And what is the emphasis of where the nightingale lives? In some melodious plot, right? So the nightingale lives in a plot of land that is melodious. It's not just the nightingale that's singing, but the place itself is melodious. It's full of numberless shadows, and there the nightingale can sing of summer in full-throated ease. Full-throated, I think, is key because I think the idea is Keats feels that he cannot sing in the way the nightingale sings. If this is really a poem about poetry, which I think it is, it's a poem about how does a poet approach the sublime beauty of what poetry really is about. The nightingale is a poet. The nightingale is a perfect poet, a poet who is singing in full-throated ease. I believe Keats is implicitly suggesting that he, as a mortal human man, will never be able to sing with the same full-throated ease as the nightingale. That's, I think, the implicit tension that's introduced at the beginning of the poem. The sad human who is narrating this poem, the sad human with the aching heart, and the dryad of the trees, the nightingale, who can sing with full-throated ease. Notice also the short line, as I mentioned, in some melodious plot. So we're going to see much more of these short lines. Many of the future ones have an even greater effect, but here it tightens the rhythm very briefly before releasing it in those final 2 lines. In some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease, right? It releases after the melodious plot. So we're going to see more of that in the future stanzas. Let's look at the second stanza now. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So in this stanza, Keats is now asking for a draught of vintage, a drink of wine, basically. In the first stanza, he introduced hemlock, opiates, right, as the sort of substances he was consuming. Now he's going further and talking about wine. Wine as another path to this dream state that will allow him to access the Nightingale's world. Notice, though, the description of wine. It's not just any wine he's asking to drink. He wants wine that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. So first of all, let's analyze that phrase. Why a long age? One thing we're going to see when we look at the Nightingale, there's a stanza later where the Nightingale becomes associated with the past, with history, and with immortality. So it makes sense that Keats would want a very old wine, a wine that has been aged a long time. Because if the Nightingale represents, poetic inspiration, right, the sublime inspiration and beautiful inspiration of the poet that Keats is trying to access, for Keats, one way to approach that is old things, right? Things from the past, things with this history to them, including the wine, cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. And he emphasizes that this wine is going to taste of flora and the country green and dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. So he associates the wine not just with wine, but with all sorts of feelings and also references to the Greek world, right? Flora, the goddess of flower. He's not just saying it tastes of flowers, he's saying it tastes of flora, right? Flora with a capital F. Because for him, the wine is not just literally a sensory experience. It is a way to access this other world. That goes back to what I said earlier. Keats is associated with sensory experience. He's a poet celebrating, in many cases, the senses. And we see that here in this stanza, too, as he celebrates drinking this wine. But, as I've said with Ode on a Grecian Urn, with these odes, Keats goes beyond simple celebration of sensory pleasure and sensory delight, right? With these odes, Keats is now saying things like wine are not just about the taste of the wine. The wine tastes of things beyond the wine, right? The wine tastes of worlds that go far beyond. This makes me think, of course, of the very first episode we did. The very first episode we did when we discussed Brideshead Revisited. If you remember, there was a passage about wine that I discussed where Charles praises the wine as being associated with the ancient world, being associated with an older knowledge than the moderns understood. I have no doubt that Yves Lenoir, a very cultured man, a very educated man, was making a reference to Ode to a Nightingale with that little section. He was very clearly, I believe, making a reference to this poem when he wrote that scene in Brideshead Revisited. So again, I love these correspondences that we can see now that we've done many episodes, right? We've been doing this for several months now. We can draw these connections between novels and poems, etc. Again, you also have the same division of this stanza into two parts. The first four describe the first draft of vintage that he wants to drink, and then second, he kind of takes it further, and he associates it with the blushful Hippocrene. It's another reference to Greek mythology, even if you don't know what it means, right? It's basically, I believe, a sacred spring, a spring in which I think the idea is it's supposed to grant you poetic powers of some kind. Whether you understand what that means or not, I think even just hearing the word Hippocrene makes you think of the Greek world, makes you think of the mythological world, and even if you didn't know it's Greek, it makes you think of a world outside of your own. It is a reference to something that is clearly not of our world. And that is part of Keats's point, right? That the Nightingale, that accessing the Nightingale's world will bring us into this more spiritual, fairy, dreamlike world. Now, the final two lines, once again, we have the same structure. Purple-stained mouth, a kind of condensed trimeter, right? A condensed line of only 3 beats. followed by this release. What is the release? The release is what he wants from the wine. So the first 8 lines of the stanza, build, 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 what he's drinking the wine. Then the last 2 lines, release. Now he's drunk the wine. This is what he wants after he will drink the wine. That I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee is the nightingale, fade away into the forest dim. Now again, what did we say at the beginning? There is this interesting tension between dreams and death. When he uses the phrase, leave the world unseen, that is a reference, of course, he's talking here about dreaming, about falling asleep and dreaming, right? Entering this dream world. But it is unmistakably a reference to death as well. It is impossible not to read that word, to read that line, and think about death, and think that that is also what Keats is referring to. Leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away. It's the tension of this poem, right? Is Keats suggesting that the only true way to access the sort of sublime poetic beauty of the nightingale is the only way to achieve that really death? It's a question that Keats leaves somewhat unanswered. Obviously, the deeper tragedy here is, John Keats published this poem in 1819. Keats himself was going to die only 2 years later, in 1821, at the age of 25. Very young, obviously. So there is this extra level of, I don't know if I want to call it irony, but certainly this extra level of melancholy if you know a little bit about Keats's life. Now, one of the things that I find is really interesting, take a look at the way this line now transfers into the next stanza. So this stanza ends with the phrase, with thee fade away into the forest dim, and we have a colon. And what follows, let's look at the next stanza. It begins actually with the word fade. So he's repeating the same word that he ended the previous stanza with. Let's read this next stanza, and then we'll discuss the transition. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret. Here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So looking first at the beginning, this is a technique he's going to do in future stanzas. He very nicely links the end of the previous stanza with the beginning of the subsequent stanza. And I think that is to help create this dreamlike rhythm, this dreamlike atmosphere. So the previous stanza ends with the line, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. And then he takes that phrase fade away and continues the idea. So there is almost this trail of associations here. With thee fade away into the forest dim. And then he takes the phrase fade away and then spins another stanza out of that. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget. So that is what it's like almost to fall into this dreamlike state, right? Where one sentence ending does not necessarily end the idea. You sort of take the phrase or the word and then you start creating more associations with it. I think it really intelligently, and he's going to do this again later, really intelligently mimics what it's like to dream, to enter this sort of trance-like, dreamlike state where one stanza kind of bleeds into the next almost. There's not a clear distinction between them. The structure, therefore, of this whole poem, the organization, it's not meant to be super rigid. It's not like Ode on a Grecian Urn, where each section, as we discussed, looks at a different part of the urn, a different subject, right, that the urn is describing. Because in Ode on a Grecian Urn, he is rational, he is clear-eyed, he is awake, he is looking at the urn in a museum, presumably. Here, he is not rational, right? He is drinking, taking opiates, hemlock, drinking from the river Lethe, falling into this trance-like, dreamlike state, which is not rational, in which these associations are more metaphorical, based on words repeating, based on associations, rather than rational connections. Now, this stanza, right, he still does the same structure, the first 4 lines versus the last 6 lines. He sets up in the first 4 lines, I want to fade away into your world, Nightingale. And then the rest of the stanza, he focuses on describing our world, which he sets up, though, as this is the world the nightingale has never known. Weariness, fever, and fret, where men sit and hear each other groan. And then he lists a series of clauses beginning with the word where in the final 6 lines. And what are the things he emphasizes? What are the images he emphasizes? Palsy, gray hairs, youth grows pale and dies, where even thinking means you are full of sorrow and despair, and where beauty loses her eyes, and even love can no longer pine at them. So he's listing all of the things that are bad about our world. And what is common among all of these things? Time and age. That's what all of these images share. He's talking about how men grow old and sick, gray-haired, where young people grow old and sick and die, where beautiful people lose their looks, and where love also fades. And that middle line, right, the sort of short line right before, right, he's talking about what thinking leads you to, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs. Now, that's a fascinating line in the midst of all of this, because what else is Keats doing in this poem but thinking? I mean, that's essentially what all this is. This is his thoughts. We are seeing his thoughts. We are seeing him thinking as he imagines, because he doesn't actually, at the beginning, take hemlock or opiates or wine. Certainly doesn't drink from the river Lethe, right? He just imagines that he does. He imagines, what if I was to take hemlock? What if I was to empty opiates into my veins? What if I was to drink from the river Lethe? Oh, what if I did drink a beautiful bottle of wine from the deep delved earth? These are all his imaginings. This whole poem is a thought experiment, an exercise. It is all him thinking. And yes, it leads him to sorrow and despair, especially in this stanza. He is thinking about the nightingale, yearning for the nightingale's world. But what does he actually think of? He doesn't first think of the nightingale's world. First, he thinks of his own world that he needs to escape. This is, I think, it's nice to put this here, right? Because later we're going to get images associated with the nightingale. But I think it's important for this poem, for the magic of this poem to work, for us to understand what Keats wants to escape. Why is the nightingale's world so desirous to Keats? Why does he want to be there so badly? It's because in our world, time exists. People grow old, people die. Youth goes away, beauty goes away, love goes away. And we are all filled with sorrow and despair. I mean, it's so bleak, but that's what Keats is saying. That's our world. And the nightingale's world is different. So let's look at the next stanza and look at what the nightingale's world is made of. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. So, he's saying he wants to fly away to the nightingale, but he emphasizes he's not going to fly charioted by Bacchus and his pards. Pards refers to leopards. Bacchus was always associated with leopards for some reason, leopards pulling his chariot. Bacchus, of course, is the god of wine. I think Keats wants to emphasize that he's not drunk, is what he's saying. He's not just drunk and sort of drifting off, charioted by Bacchus. For him, the wine, of course, is a symbol of something more ancient, right? Something more essential than just wine. It is poetry, as we said, and he says it right here. I want to fly away to the nightingale on the viewless wings of poesy. Why viewless? This is part of the big theme here, and we're going to see it at the end of this stanza too. For Keats, the sensory world, sensory experience, right, including sight, sometimes gets in the way of poetry. That's what makes this such a different poem from Keats's Eve of St. Agnes, which was a celebration of sensory pleasure. This poem is not a celebration of the senses because for him, actually, the Nightingale's world, the ideal world of the Nightingale, is one in which Keats does not see. Instead, the sense he focuses on actually is sound, right? The sound of the nightingale singing. He does not want to see things. Poesy to him is viewless. It's something beyond the sight. It is something beyond his immediate sensory perception. Right, what does he say? The dull brain perplexes and retards. He's essentially saying his brain, the processing center, you could say, of his senses, actually perplexes him, confuses him, and slows him down, retards him. He wants to go beyond his own brain. That's important, again, when we talked earlier about rationality in the context of Ode on a Grecian Urn. This poem is suggesting that to access this poetic imagination, you have to go beyond what is rational. You have to go beyond your dull brain. And then he starts describing in the last 6 lines of the stanza what the world of the nightingale is like. It is, there's that wonderful phrase, tender is the night, which Fitzgerald famously used later, the title of one of his novels. The queen moon is on her throne. He personifies the moon as a queen on her throne, surrounded by starry fays. The stars are like fays or spirits or fairies. And what's important, there is no light. So even though he describes the stars, the starry fays, he really emphasizes there's no light here. The only light is the light from heaven that is blown down by the breezes. I think that's the key pivot of the stanza, that line, but here there is no light. Right? As we said earlier, those short lines, right? That's trimeter, right? 3 beats, but here there is no light. Those short lines often provide this kind of almost like moment of tension before release in these stanzas. And we'd get that here too. It's almost a pivot in the stanza. But here there is no light, and we wonder, why is there no light? Tension, tension, release. The light is from heaven, with breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. Again, we end with forest imagery, right? We end with forest imagery, the image of mossy, sort of gloomy trees that Keats is making his way through. You have to imagine Keats is listening to the sound, the song of the nightingale. He cannot see because there is no light, and he is making his way through the verdurous glooms and the winding mossy ways. This is a wonderful image of what it's like to pursue this poetic imagination, to pursue this non-rational, dreamlike, trance-like call through the woods. I think it's such a fascinating, wonderful image of writing, of the experience of writing poetry, or really anything. I mean, Keats is talking about poetry, but you could expand this to lots of different artistic endeavors. It's as if you are, trying to listen to a distant song of a nightingale that is so beautiful. You can't see it, and you have to just use the light from heaven to try and follow, right, your way through this verdurous gloom, through this winding mossy forest. Such a beautiful image of the act of writing poetry. Now, the next stanza, he does the same thing. He's going to transition in the next stanza, but he's going to continue the same idea. He described here walking through the verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. Now he's going to continue describing that in the next stanza. So let's look at the next stanza. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. But in embalmed darkness, guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. So what does he say? He says he can't actually see what's in front of him. And obviously, why can't he? Because the previous stanza emphasized there is no light. So we quite literally continue right where the previous stanza left off. Again, it's that just like what we said earlier, in this poem, Keats has this kind of drifting structure where each stanza seems to drift from the previous one, to kind of pick up and continue, because that's the logic of the dream. It is not the rational logic of other structures, other poetic structures in which each stanza corresponds to some different idea or part or section, but rather each stanza is kind of just following our narrator, our poet, as he makes his way through these winding forests. And of course, he says he can't see the flowers at his feet, he can't see the incense on the boughs, but he can smell them. And he can guess, right, what the flowers are. Now, this is an interesting stanza because on the one hand, it's very beautiful. The description of all of these flowers, the description of the musk rose at the end, the dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies. It's very romantic. But I believe if you really look closely at this stanza, if you read the stanza closely, there are images of death kind of folded into the descriptions of the flowers. And Keats doesn't yet comment upon death, but he's going to comment upon death in the next stanza. So it's an interesting tension in the stanza between the beauty of the rhythms, the beauty of the descriptions of the flowers, and the unmistakable images of death that he kind of weaves in here. So obviously we have the phrase embalmed darkness. Embalmed, of course, you embalm a body after it dies, a word very clearly associated with death. Even these descriptions of the flowers, right? He ends that description with the phrase, fast fading violets covered up in leaves. The violets are dying. They are fast fading. They are covered up in leaves. It's almost like the violets are being buried. And then we end with the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. On the one hand, it's a kind of beautiful, peaceful image associated with summer. And remember, the Nightingale singest of summer at the beginning. But flies are not a positive image necessarily. Flies can be associated with death, decay. So even as Keats celebrates the beauty of the flowers in this dreamy world, the point is he cannot escape death. Why can he not escape death? Because he is a human. He is immortal. The nightingale is not. Let's look at the next stanza where death becomes more explicit. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. So I believe this is the stanza in which the poem pivots. This is the turn. This is the turn in the poem. So up to this point, he has been, he imagines falling asleep, falling into this dreamlike state, listening to the nightingale. And the past two stanzas have been relatively positive, as we've said. Now, in this next stanza, the death becomes more explicit. So first, of course, he sets up the idea that he's been thinking about death. And he thinks about suicide pretty explicitly here. He says, maybe this is the time to die, when I'm listening to you. So essentially in this stanza, he considers death. He considers suicide. He says, wouldn't this be the perfect time to die? Because I'm listening to you. He says, to cease upon the midnight with no pain. I would die with no pain. Why no pain? Well, we talked about the opiates at the beginning, the hemlock. So there were these images of death at the beginning. This idea of suicide was suggested at the beginning. So he says here, right, if I was to die now, there would be no pain. But also he says there's no pain because the nightingale is pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. In other words, this would be the perfect time to die because he can hear the nightingale singing. And isn't it right to die at this moment of transcendence, of poetic transcendence? He has, you imagine again, he is a poet. He is trying to access poetic imagination. And he says he's found this perfect poetic imagination, the beauty of the nightingale's song. Wouldn't this be the perfect time to die now that he's found it? But what happens at the end? Again, remember we talked about the stanzas always pivot on that short line. A lot of the stanzas pivot on that short line. In such an ecstasy. After that line, still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain. To thy high requiem become a sod. So what does that mean? He says, even after I would die, you would still be singing, and I would have ears in vain. So he realizes if he kills himself, if he dies, the nightingale is going to keep singing, and he will no longer be able to listen to the nightingale. He will have ears in vain. And then we get this wonderful contrast in the final line, to thy high requiem become a sod. So he says, he contrasts the nightingale's high requiem, high song of beauty, and he, Keats, if he dies, he will become a sod, a piece of earth. There's this elemental contrast here between air and earth, right? Between the sort of sublime beauty, the sublime poetic beauty of the nightingale's airy high requiem and the ugly earthiness of Keats's dead body, the sod. That contrast existed in the previous stanza as well, and I think now we understand it more. The flowers, the dying flowers, are like human beings. We live, we might be beautiful, but we die young. We are like the fast-fading violets. By contrast, the nightingale is forever. The nightingale is a high requiem, not a sod, associated with the air and not the earth. Right, so the nightingale is above the flowers, beyond the flowers. The nightingale does not die. That is what Keats's poet realizes in this stanza. He realizes, and he always knew this, but now he understands what it means, that the nightingale is immortal. And he no longer finds it beautiful. He now feels pain because he becomes aware, and that's the key of this stanza, and I think of the whole poem, he becomes aware of his own mortality. We talked earlier about, there's that line, too happy in thine happiness. That's essentially where he ends up again, right? He realizes, I actually can't be so happy in the nightingale's presence because it's simply a reminder that I am mortal like these flowers and the nightingale is eternal. And the next stanza, he pretty much says it. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the selfsame song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that ofttimes hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. So this is my favorite stanza of the poem. It's one of the most beautiful stanzas, I think, in all of English poetry. You know, he first emphasizes, right, this new knowledge that he has, this new revelation that he's reached. The nightingale is immortal. The nightingale has been here forever. The song that he is hearing this passing night, the word passing is so important because he's contrasting in this stanza immortality with mortality. This night is passing. It's going to pass quickly. Before he knows it, it's going to be morning. Before he knows it, time will move on because he is mortal and he experiences time. For him, all nights are passing nights. But for the nightingale, this night is forever. The nightingale is eternal. The nightingale is immortal. The nightingale will sing forever. The same song that he is hearing was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. I like that contrast between emperor and clown. Keats wants to emphasize that no matter who you are in the human world, whether you are an emperor, whether you are a clown, it is the same because you are a mortal person and you will die, right? Hungry generations will tread thee down. It means you are in the earth, you are buried, and people will be walking above you. They will be treading you down. That's what it means to be human. It doesn't matter if you are an emperor or a clown. It doesn't matter your social status. You will die. Keats will die. The nightingale will not. And before, this gave Keats a sense of sublime poetic beauty. This was the poetic beauty that he sought. Now it makes him feel sad. Now it makes him feel, as the rest of this stanza suggests, like Ruth. This is one of my favorite lines where he talks about Ruth. Now, this is a biblical reference. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know a lot of biblical references, and the truth is, I don't think you need to understand the beauty of this line. In fact, I think it's more powerful if you forget the biblical reference of Ruth and just think about, what do we know? Keats tells us all we need to know about Ruth. She's sad. She's sick for home. She's an exile of some kind. She's away from home. She's standing in tears amid the alien corn. Right? You imagine she's somewhere far from home, standing in tears amid alien corn, and she's hearing that same song. What I love about the way this line is written, though, is it says, "It found a path through the sad heart of Ruth." And the way the lines are written, it's like we are following the Nightingale song as it finds a path through the poem. And that is reflected in the path it takes through the sad heart of Ruth. This is one long sentence that's divided into 3 lines with a series of, divisions and clauses, and that is the sort of path, in a way, that the song takes through Ruth. So why is she standing in tears amid the alien corn? Why do we think Keats makes this reference? The idea is obviously Keats feels like Ruth. He feels sick for home. He stands in tears amid the alien corn. But why? What is the home that Keats is sick for? Why does Keats feel like he's standing amid the alien corn? This is really interesting. And my interpretation, I don't know if this is the right interpretation, but my interpretation is, this is a song about Keats's longing for this poetic inspiration, this world that the Nightingale has access to, this dream world this fairy world that will enable him to reach these poetic heights. But he can't actually reach them because he is mortal. He is human, and that's what he realizes here, that he will never get to that point. Right? The last 2 lines, "Charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn." He feels as though he will never actually reach those fairylands, that they are simply visible through a window, through an open magic casement, but that's it. In between him and the fairylands are perilous seas, and it leaves him feeling forlorn. So he cannot actually access or reach the world of the Nightingale, the queen moon in the sky surrounded by her starry fays. Instead, he is like Ruth. He is standing in our world, and he feels like this world is like standing amid alien corn. I think these 2 lines, right, about Ruth and the alien corn, I think they're the heart of the poem. I think it's a connection he's drawing to this biblical figure to suggest that being mortal and longing for the immortal, right, being mortal and longing for the immortality of poetry is like being Ruth standing in tears amid the alien corn. I love the phrase alien corn because it's so strange. It's so off. It's not the beautiful lyrical 19th. It's not even a phrase we associate with the 19th century. It feels so modern to our ears. But it works to emphasize the strangeness of what Ruth, and by extension what Keats, is feeling. That he feels as though his true home is in some poetic universe inhabited by the Nightingale, and he will never get there because he is mortal and he will die. And he can never achieve that poetic immortality. And it's so beautiful and so tragic, and it hits you because we all feel this, don't we? We all live in the mortal world. We all face the reality of what Keats described earlier, aging, people growing old, young people growing old, beauty fading, love fading. We face all those things. And we might long for immortality, and we might hear snatches of immortality at times in our lives, metaphorical Nightingale songs that we hear and follow, listening. But in the end, we can't ever reach what the Nightingale represents. We will always be trapped in our world, sick for home, home being poetic immortality, home being poetic inspiration, the Hippocrene fountains on Mount Helicon. We all crave those things, but we can never get there, and it leaves us feeling sad amid our alien corn. The irony is, This is the only home we know, of course. This is the only world that human beings can inhabit. It is our world, and yet it feels alien when we imagine or think about the Nightingale's song. It feels like we are in alien corn, in the same way that Ruth, right, was sick for home amid alien corn. And it leaves you feeling, like I said, I think that's the key line of the poem, because it's the point that Keats's poet reaches, the point that Keats's speaker reaches, this realization and understanding that he will not achieve what he wanted to achieve listening to the Nightingale. And that's why it ends, the final two images of this stanza end with the perilous seas and the fairylands forlorn. And look at the final stanza. Remember, as I've talked about, this poem is structured around associations. The images and phrases and words that end one section drift into the next section, drift into the next stanza. And we get it one final time with this word forlorn. So let's read this final stanza and analyze it. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So the word forlorn introduces this stanza, right, and it connects directly to the previous line. Again, it's that idea of dream association. That's the structure of this poem. One word triggers something in our head. In this case, it literally triggers him awake. The word forlorn is like a bell that wakes him up from this dreamlike trance that he's been in. So he wakes up and he realizes the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do. Fancy meaning the fantasy of the Nightingale song, the sort of artificiality of the Nightingale song. But also, fancy is associated with art, right? The idea is, if the Nightingale represents poetry or art, right, it is fantasy, it is fancy, it is artificial, it is something created that cannot cheat so well. He's saying, it's not a substitute for real life in the end. The Nightingale song does go away. It does fade. He even calls the Nightingale a deceiving elf because he's angry now. Why is Keats angry here? Why is the poet angry? He's angry because this feeling cannot last. He's angry because he cannot escape forever into the Nightingale's world. He cannot escape forever into this poetic world, this world of art and music. He has to be brought back to our mortal world. And so he has to say goodbye to the Nightingale. Adieu, adieu. And how does he describe the Nightingale's song now? It's a plaintive anthem, and it fades, and he describes as it sort of drifts away, back to the meadows, over the stream, up the hill, and is buried deep. Remember earlier he used this image of unearthing the wine from the ground, right? He said it was buried a long while in the deep delved earth, and he had dug it up and drunk. That was a symbol, of course. The wine was not literal. It was a symbol of poetry. It was a symbol of the Nightingale's song. Well, here, now, it's being buried again. The Nightingale song, the wine, the art, the beauty, the world, etc. Everything he experienced, buried again in the next valley glade. And he ends with this, he's left with this question, was it a vision or a waking dream? Do I wake or sleep? That's the final question he leaves us on, and he doesn't answer it. In other words, he's asking, was everything I just experienced just a dream? Or was it something more? As in, am I really now asleep? It's that question he asked earlier at the beginning. The tension between sleep and death now kind of comes full circle, because now he's asking the question, maybe that was the real world, and maybe I'm asleep right now. Maybe our mortal lives that we experience on this earth, maybe this is really sleep. And maybe when we die, we wake up in that beautiful, eternal world, poetic world of the Nightingale. Of course, we can't know. We can't know because, obviously, we cannot come back from death. He's implicitly asking this question at the end, And he's leaving it unanswered because the point is we can never answer it. We don't know what is the real world and what is the dream, right? We don't know whether we wake or sleep. So what's the conclusion here? Right, what is the point of this poem? Why is this poem so meaningful and significant? As I said, I believe it's a description of Keats's narrator, of Keats himself, realizing some truth about immortality and death. Right? As I said, it's that line about Ruth. He realizes that his world, the human world, is a world of death, is a world where things will die. The Nightingale's world is immortal, but also that he cannot access the Nightingale's world, that it is impossible to be there forever, that it is a fleeting world that then disappears as soon as we wake up. But look at how it ends. It leaves him wondering or questioning what is real and what is not. Now, what does this have to do with poetry, with the poetic imagination? As I said, if the Nightingale represents poetry, represents an attempt to write or access a poetic world, do we think Keats reaches that at the end? I would argue that he does. I would argue that the last few lines suggest that even though Keats could not live forever in that artificial dreamscape that the Nightingale created for him, even though Keats had to return to the modern world, he returns to the modern world changed. It began with him confessing that his heart ached, that he felt sad and melancholy. It ends with him having experienced this and come back. Perhaps he still feels melancholy, right? I mean, he certainly does. It says forlorn at the end. But it's a different kind of melancholy. It's a melancholy that comes from the knowledge of immortality and death. And he asks this question, do I wake or sleep? And I believe that is evidence of the change that Keats' narrator experiences. He now sees the world differently. He understands that there is another world, a dream world, a world of poetry and music, the world of the Nightingale. He realizes that this world exists at the end. And it ends with, it's complex because it's not totally positive. He has an awareness of death and mortality that he didn't before, but that Keats, I think, is suggesting that this is the path to becoming a poet. To become a true poet, you need to understand this truth. You need to bring yourself to a point where you can ask this question, do I wake or sleep? Where you realize that the poetic power, the poetic beauty and imagination that you're striving for is in some ways in a world beyond our world. And this is what makes this poem different from, like I said before, something like the Eve of St. Agnes, which is a more pure celebration of sensory pleasure. This is also why I think it's wrong to call Keats a hedonist or a hedonistic poet or a poet who celebrates the sensory world, because even as he celebrates the sensory world, he also questions it, as we see in this poem. And it ends, this question, do I wake or sleep? He is quite literally questioning reality. He is questioning the reality of the world around him. He no longer trusts his senses. His senses would tell him, yes, you are awake. You can hear, smell, see, touch. What the Nightingale has done for him has enabled him to move beyond the senses and to experience a world above sensory pleasure. This is the exact same thing that the urn led him to do in Ode on a Grecian Urn, to realize that there was something beyond the sensual ear, if you remember that phrase. And so I think both Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale are poems that complicate our understanding of Keats as a poet of the senses. And really, I think what they show us is that Romanticism is not hedonism. Romanticism is not a celebration of sensory pleasure, even though Romantics do take delight in sensory pleasure. A lot of the Romantic poets, we're going to see this later when we discuss Coleridge and Kubla Khan, a lot of the Romantic poets believe there is something more than just the sensory world. There is a dream world, a fairy world. And that is where poetry lives. And we human beings can access it, but only for a moment. And that's poetry. That's what it means to be a poet, to have these dreams, to wake up, to begin questioning things, to see the world differently, to imagine and remember this other poetic world. And when we write poetry, that is the world we are accessing, according to Keats. And so I think it's just such a beautiful, by the end, it's such a beautiful poem that, again, through its rhythms, as we talked about, through its rhyme scheme, right? Remember the division of the poem based on rhyme scheme, the division of each stanza based on rhyme scheme into 4 lines followed by 6. The musicality, especially of that trimeter line that shortens everything. And we haven't even really talked about the complicated way that Keats changes, right, the iambs when necessary. You know, the very last line, fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? It's not simple iambic pentameter, right? Fled, the first word is accented, so it feels different than a traditional iambic pentameter. Keats does that throughout this poem to complicate our rhythmic sense of mortality and immortality. Ultimately, though, and this is why I think Keats, this poem is quite pessimistic. You could argue this poem, some people might say, is it a push to suicide? I don't believe it is. I believe it is, and I don't even necessarily believe it's that pessimistic, because I think in the end, despite the pessimism, despite the knowledge of death, Keats is also suggesting it is the knowledge of death that enabled him to understand poetry. If this poem began with a poet, with Keats yearning to try and understand the immortal world of the Nightingale, in order to have access, right, to this poetic imagination, it ends with him almost realizing that actually he will never truly inhabit the Nightingale's dream world. He will never truly understand it because he is mortal, but this does not stop him from being a poet. That last question, do I wake or do I sleep, seems to almost suggest, and this is one interpretation of it, a poet who has understood what poetry is. Poetry is the human being achieving this brief access to this immortal world and then losing it. And it is in that access and loss, which is what Keats experiences here, that we get the truth of poetry, and that we get, I think, the truth of all art. All right. With that, let's wrap up there. Thank you all for listening. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And I will see you all next time.